Hey, it's Master of None once more, and I just wanted to take some time today to talk some about this bad boy, The Hobbit. First read this book when I was in third grade, and it was the first book that I actually read myself. And It is the OG, from 1937. It was first published, and interestingly, that was also the year that Snow White, the original cartoon Snow White movie, came out. And I just find that a curious resonance, two kind of famous tales of like a band involving a band of dwarves. It's just like interesting. They came out the same year, I suppose. Now, it is a children's story in a way, but Tolkien actually termed it a fairy story. It it includes many timeless archetypal themes worthy of adult consideration. Interestingly, it's a very charming and whimsical book, to be sure. And I kind of see me and others see Tolkien as kind of like a regenerator of many of these cool Western mythologies, Celtic, Norse, Germanic, even some Greek in there for sure. I would think, like the dwarves seem reminiscent of the Telkines, but and Tolkien being a World War One veteran, kind of little Walt Disney, there, it's really interesting. So he kind of has a lot of in his works. There's a lot of kind of skepticism for kind of mankind's shortcomings, or and kind of the different races have their disputes, and there's kind of warfare and darkness brewing kind of themes, um, so it's very interesting, to note that World War One surely must have shaped a lot of Tolkien's kind of vibe, in his writing for sure. And He went to Oxford, and you have the Inklings and all this, just really cool stuff that Tolkien's working with. And I'd like to hop around in a semi chronological order, no promises. Kind of mention some of my favorite parts of the book. So the beginning, of course, kind of starts in the Shire. And the hobbits seem to have this sort of Epicurean lifestyle. They're kind of hanging out, eating food, and engage in festival and plant cultivation and brewing beer and drinking beer. And it's a bit, which can be a bit reminiscent of those of us fortunate enough to have a semi-comfortable modern life. It can seem a bit Shire-like, just kind of the modern amenities. But of course, even the people lucky enough to be in, a first world or a comfortable situation, still have their difficulties, to be sure. And many people are highly uncomfortable, of course. But it kind of, the modern world can sometimes be a bit Shire-like, I suppose, a bit paradisical. But you kind of have this Eden-like vibe in the Shire, more towards the west, and where Bilbo and Frodo begin their tales. And at the beginning, Gandalf comes upon kind of the adult Bilbo smoking his pipe, and Bilbo doesn't remember Gandalf from when he was a kid, and encountered Gandalf on several occasions, doing cool firework displays, at the Shire festivals, and and he was very fond of it at the time. But now he's like, oh, who's this character, on my porch, kind of, he's kind of just wants to be like left alone. He's kind of like grumpy and such. Um, he seems like inconvenienced, that a stranger's walking. He's just very, very in this grumpy, set in his ways mindset. And he has a very much reluctance, to embark on anything resembling what he ends up embarking upon, there's an interesting degree of kind of ignorance is bliss kind of functionality there, where Bilbo probably doesn't ever engage upon what happens in this book, if he's fully aware of what he's getting into. So that's a worthy note. And even when Bilbo greets Gandalf good morning, Gandalf has this kind of perplexing response. Gandalf responds, "What do you mean? Do you wish me good morning, or mean that it is a good morning whether I want it or not, or that you feel good this morning, or that it is a morning to be good on?" And it's like, goodness, chill out, but but it shows how people kind of throw out these words and phrases sometimes with very non-specific intent, like, "Oh, good morning, nice weather," but they're it can be kind of almost a lack of intention or real care. It's just kind of a placeholder or something, which is nice to be sure, and you want to be pleasant, of course, and act like you're saying hi, but Gandalf just isn't buying it or something. Gandalf, and it just shows this kind of multiplicity of perspective and kind of this discerning, wizard mind of Gandalf, because Gandalf sort of journeys in Middle Earth, and in his capacity as one of the Astari, to attempting to guide and help those he can, and for some reason he thinks Bilbo's a good fit for this new quest he's kind of tinkering on putting together, he additionally helps. He thinks Bilbo may be a good fit, and he also thinks that it'll help shake Bilbo out of his grumpy ways. So it's kind of a mutual beneficial kind of Gandalf being a caretaker of the beings of Middle Earth kind of thing going on there. So it's very cool. Gandalf the steward, of the peoples of Middle Earth, kind of neat. So Gandalf solicits this kind of quest to Bilbo, and he's like, "No, good day," or he's not really having it. He basically declines, but then later that evening, I believe, or something, these dwarves kind of slowly start kind of appearing at his door and kind of inviting themselves in and such. And they're raiding his pantry, and kind of being expecting and ungrateful. And he's like, "Well, what is going on here?" And, and then eventually, the beans are spilled because Gandalf kind of shows up with one of the groups of dwarves at the end. And I believe Thorin Oakenshield, like the lead dwarf, the heir to the throne of Erebor, essentially. He's like the guy, he comes last. But, and eventually, Bilbo, this isn't a chance, encounter anymore. This, they kind of lay out the nature of their quest, and Gandalf presents Thorin with kind of the Thor's map and like the key, that will eventually lead to this hidden side door in the mountain, and then we have the first mention of kind of one of the major antagonists, the story, this Smaug, this dragon, that has taken the mountain unrighteously, and he's just kind of hanging there amongst all the gold. It's like, wait, so they, it's kind of this reclamation quest as well as an adventure into the unknown. And once Bilbo's kind of gets a dose of the real kind of some of the real hazards that this may entail, he's kind of out. And I believe the next morning, the dwarves are maybe hanging at the Green Dragon Inn, like maybe giving Bilbo a little longer to make up his mind, because they essentially need Bilbo as the burglar. That's his functionality there, because dwarves are very unsneaky. They're kind of warrior-like miners, and such. And you even get a little bit of and even Tolkien mentioned this, the dwarves are even based somewhat on the Jews, kind of the wandering Hebrews, the Exodus, and the dwarves, many of them have been exiled from their homeland, so. And they've been unscrupulous, money-minded, the stereotypes. So even Tolkien admits this. There's a little kind of Jew Hebrew kind of going there with the dwarves. So it's a very interesting interesting note. But they're kind of warriors, so they need a burglar. They need like this hobbit that's gonna, insinuate himself and end up doing the most dangerous task of confronting the dragon by himself. So, um, so essentially, they're hanging out with the Green Dragon. They end up going without him, I believe, and or I believe at the last moment, Bilbo ends up tagging along, kind of as they're leaving the Green Dragon, or as they're about to, or something or other. And again, this is partly because of Bilbo's ignorance, because he doesn't fully know what he's getting into, but he's already showing a lot of bravery and courage, just to, because he knows there's a dragon, involved, or but it's kind of this, they perceive with this incredulous naivete about the whole thing, like, well, won't he just eat you and catch you on fire or something? But so essentially they carry on, and we get very, very soon to this kind of this troll part, where they kind of set up their first camp or two or something. They don't get very far out of the Shire's kind of safety aura, and then they Bilbo and maybe Fili and Kili, kind of the dwarf twins, I believe, they go off to see where some of the ponies have went missing to. They're already encountering problems that they weren't bargaining upon. And there's these Bert, Tom, and William or something. They encounter these three trolls that are in the process of, like, they're going to cook their ponies and stuff that they've taken. And then they see Bilbo and Fili and Kili, and then they're like, oh, we'll eat you too, or, so score, so they get them, and then the other dwarfs come, and at this time, Gandalf had already, one of the first times Gandalf goes and does Gandalf things. Like, he I don't think Gandalf is quite present at this moment. He's doing something. But then the rest of the dwarves come try to help, quote unquote. They're just captured too. And then the trolls begin to argue, how are we going to prepare them? How are we going to cook them? We'll squash them to jelly, or we'll roast them, or, and then, the dwarves and Bilbo are like, oh no, we're kind of in trouble. Or and, well, apparently Gandalf is hanging out nearby in the trees and has kind of come back to the party just in time. And Gandalf kind of hangs out, and then from afar, using wizard kind of manipulation, he kind of imitates one of the voices of the trolls and kind of eggs them on against each other, which is a cool kind of story device there. So and this elaborates on until morning, and what happens when trolls encounter sunlight? Well, they're turned to stone. This is a really cool Norse myth, I believe. Kind of obscure, perhaps, by the time that Tolkien did. So, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, as Tolkien's not the sole perpetuator of this, probably, but this is kind of this is a pretty cool little myth, that, of course, you have, you got a little bit of golems and gargoyles kind of going on there. So this has been around a bit, like these creatures turning to stone, or a golem, being from stone. And indeed, even the dwarves, it's kind of this idea they come from stone or something. But it's a fun concept. Oh, and you got a little bit of the vampire thing there, this aversion to sunlight, of kind of some of the evil creatures and stuff. So it's kind of neat. They seem to do better in darkness. But the trolls are turned to stone, kind of by Gandalf's cunning, egging them on and making them take too long to prepare their supper, and they never get it. They're turned to stone. And then, even some Medusa there too. So this whole turning to stone thing is just an interesting thing. Well, they raid the troll horde. They find the trolls have this stash, essentially. The trolls had these some really cool stuff. It turns out they have a glam ring, faux hammer, and then they have Orcrist, the goblin cleaver or something it's called. But they have Glambring and Orcrist and some other good cool swords from Gondolin and some gold and such. But in Gondolin was this high elven city, this refuge city kind of nestled in the northern mountains, in the First Age, and it's like this legendary high elven city from the First Age. And apparently some of the the swords of incredible craftsmanship have wound up in this troll lair. They're just bummed out in this cave that the trolls have stashed, which is kind of neat. And Gandalf lets on that these swords glow blue in proximity to orcs or goblins, which is a really cool kind of sentience or ability or magic, high technology kind of on the part of these swords. Like what do they have? Bluetooth? Like how do they know, when goblins or orcs are near? So it's, again, kind of this Tolkien-esque kind of giving life or intelligence to these what would otherwise be semi-inanimate objects. A little bit of animism there, perhaps, but very cool. And this will come in handy many times for Bilbo, his little Gondolin sword. So they carry on from there, and we get to the kind of the edge of the wild kind of theme. And so here's Thor's map, and then you get oops, come on, baby. But then you get here, so this line here is kind of the edge of the wild, and it makes me think of RuneScape, like how you could go to the north edge of the wild, and then you could do PvP there. If anyone remembers that old computer game RuneScape, of course. So maybe they got it from Tolkien's maps. Who knows? It's probably a far-flung idea, but it's a fun idea. You kind of have this demarcation line of like, oh, you go beyond here, oh, you're really in the thick of it now, or something. It's kind of fun. So, and then of course you go even farther west from the Shire to you have the Undying Lands, Valinor, the elves' pilgrimage, kind of back to their homeland. It's kind of the elvish motherland, if you will. And then you go east, and it's like, oh, like darkness is encroaching. It's like the more you go east, it's kind of more untamed and more kind of evils grows there or something. And in the west, you kind of have like almost heaven, like elves come from there, and then and you have this whole other continent, far west. But so anyways, they keep going east, gotta do cool stuff, gotta go on the journey, gotta go into difficulties, so they carry on east, which is indeed their quest towards the Lonely Mountain. Their next stop is Rivendell, which is speaking of Gondolin, it's, it's kind of a high elf little refuge, little kind of beautiful town, I believe, kind of sanctuary, stewarded by the elvish lord Elrond. And he is a really cool cat because he helps them read kind of some of the moonlight runes on Thor's map. So they don't even know how they're so naive on their quest that they don't even know how they're going to get into the mountain yet. They know they have a key and a map. Well, Gandalf knew that they would need Elrond's advice to help read these moonlight runes on the map. Well, they make it there. There's kind of this synchronicity, or they make it there just in time or something, and it's like they get the moon of autumn or something like this. And it's always fall and autumn at Rivendell. It's this beautiful place. In the Peter Jackson films, he depicts it really well. It's just this drop dead beautiful area, and it's kind of stewarded by the elves. And although it is just east of the edge of the wild, and then you get the idea that Rivendell is the last homely house in the west. So this is kind of the last stop, where it's going to be anywhere near this chill. And you of course have kind of these little outposts of like, but mostly you go east and it's kind of more hazardous. But so they get all fixed up, get some rest at Rivendell, and they kind of get some clues on their map, and it's going to eventually help them find this secret door into the mountain, into Erebor, the Lonely Mountain, once they get there later in the journey. But first they have to cross this mountain range, the Misty Mountains. So, and it's always difficulty, determining how to cross the mountains, which is the safest pass in the way. So they're following Gandalf, and they kind of, it's getting stormy and stuff, and they kind of need shelter and need to take a break for the night, and they're kind of going into the mountains, and they eventually happen upon this cave, and it's they think it's a sort of safe place, but it turns out to be a trap. It's a trap. But and but they don't know that yet. They take refuge in the cave, and they want to make a fire, do some food, and Gandalf's like, no, we're not doing that. We're just, we don't know what's here yet and stuff. So you get a little bit of this. It reminds me of like World War II in the Pacific, perhaps, when you're kind of in hostile, unknown territory, and you would definitely want to make a fire, but perhaps it's hard, and even if you can, you shouldn't, because it will reveal your position, so it's kind of that idea. So Gandalf says no fire, okay, everyone go to bed, or we'll start at break of dawn or whatever. Well, Bilbo has trouble sleeping, and he kind of has this little prophetic kind of intuition. He has this little prophetic dream of like a crack opening up in their little cave shelter, and like just something isn't right or something, and then he wakes up, and it turns out his intuition was correct in his sleep, that this isn't a cave at all. This is like like a trapdoor-esque mechanism. This is like the goblin's new front door. It's a cave, but it's actually to draw people in, probably as food, or something. So this crack opens up, and then like goblins come in and kind of ambush the dwarves, and they're kind of hostages. Well, basically, Gandalf. I think Gandalf separates at that point. I forget exactly how, but Gandalf kind of gets away or something, and then they're taking the dwarves and Bilbo to their leader, the Great Goblin, in the mountain. And they're in a very bad spot now. And then Bilbo's just such a little guy, and he's kind of sneaky. His burglar aspects. They kind of forget Bilbo. It's like. So they kind of leave Bilbo behind on accident, where they're leading their hostages to their leader, the Great Goblin. So Bilbo gets separated essentially, and he ends up actually falling into this crevice of some sort, I believe, and that will lead him to his encounter with Gollum in a bit here. But anyways, the dwarven party is taken on to the Great Goblin, and they're hostages, and the Great Goblin's like, like, what are you doing here, and explain yourselves, and then they're not doing a very good job of being diplomatic or explaining themselves, however diplomatic you could be to the Great Goblin. Like, he's kind of gonna be an a-hole anyways, right? So but essentially, and then they notice that they've confiscated this sword Orcrist from Thorin, and they're all like, oh, because they know hundreds of their kin in the past have been killed by this very sword. So like even the dumb goblins, seem to recognize some things when they're in trouble, or they're like, oh, you have the goblin cleaver, oh, kill all of them, or he like tweaks out, and like he just orders like his people to take the dwarves out, because they're like enraged, that he would bring the sword here, and just the whole thing. Well, Gandalf kind of does Gandalf stuff at the last minute. He conjures this blue light, and kind of disperses the goblins and blinds everyone, and it's like this blast wave, and then like Gandalf like one hit KOs the Great Goblin, with his sword glamoring, and then he's kind of like, take up arms and fight, follow me, and they kind of like make off on their escape, but there's still like presumably like millions of goblins after them or whatever. Gandalf can't. Gandalf has incredible functionality, and he pops in, and does cool Gandalf stuff at times, but if he could just do everything, there wouldn't even be a story, right? But and even presumably a powerful being, you can still be overrun by millions of goblins, perhaps. So you'd suspend your disbelief a bit there, but they're kind of tracked by all these goblins, and they're in their lair, so they kind of got to get out of Dodge there. So they're following Gandalf, and they're making their way out under great peril, you know. Well, then we cut back to Bilbo, and what's happened to Bilbo, right? Then you get this really cool Riddles in the Dark chapter, where he kind of encounters Gollum. So Bilbo falls down this kind of crevice cave, bumps his head but doesn't die, lucky thing. But he's in the dark, fumbling around, wondering where he is, and he picks up this ring, which of course turns out to be like a very fateful thing or something. So he picks up this ring. He doesn't know what it is yet or anything. He's like, huh, you know, puts it in his pocket. Like, wow, lucky find there. And he stumbles along, and he eventually finds out he's kind of at the edge of this cold, giant subterranean lake, and he's kind of doesn't even want to get in it. You know, who knows what foul things are lurking in it. You know, think Watcher in the Water from Fellowship of the Rings or so. You know, I mean, it's just you know, it's like horror, you know. You know, it's a very scary concept to try to... So he's kind of stuck here, and eventually this creature kind of paddle boats up to him, and he just sees his eyes glowing in the dark. And this is Gollum. And this is like a kind of goblin human, like we don't know what he is yet, but he's kind of this hunched little creature with long, slender fingers and some hair on his head, but he's mostly bald, and he's kind of gray looking and has these pale blue eyes. He's really wigged out, to be honest. And he kind of catches fish and has survived somehow in this subterranean lake area, you know, by himself. And Bilbo and him converse some, and Bilbo's really freaked out at first, like, ugh. And then they end up conversing some, and Bilbo draws his sword on him immediately because he's freaked out. And they end up playing this riddle game, high-stakes riddle game, so that if Bilbo wins the game, Gollum will show him the way out. And if he loses, Gollum gets to eat him, or, you know, so don't lose that game. Now, so they have a really cool series of riddles here. It's kind of this clever thing. They're kind of these elaborate riddles, but the answers to these riddles are kind of these archetypal, cool, simple concepts. Like one of them's what grows but doesn't need sun, or you know, what grows by itself or something, and it's a mountain. And then one of them's like darkness, and then the answer to another riddle's time. So these are really cool riddles that they do. And Tolkien even invokes the idea of kind of the sacred nature of the riddle game here. So it's kind of a cool mention here, you know. It's just kind of like the sacred idea of, like, if you can outwit someone intellectually, then maybe you'll be spared or something, you know, and you have to honor it. You know, it's kind of a cool thing. But eventually, Bilbo's kind of hanging on in the game, and eventually Bilbo's having trouble thinking of another riddle, and he kind of feels in his pocket again and feels this ring, and he's like, Bilbo's kind of accidentally thinks aloud. He's like, what have I got in my pocket? And Gollum interprets that as the next riddle. So it's like Bilbo Tolkien invokes this sacred nature of the riddle game, and not soon after, Bilbo essentially accidentally cheats at the game. You know, so it's a cool story device to just give Bilbo kind of an OP question that Gollum can't answer. Like, what have I got in my pocket? Well, that's not a riddle. That's a specific question of an invisible object in his pocket. That's like a cheat, you know. Well, Gollum's like, not fair, you know, but he plays along, and he can't answer it. And then Gollum's upset, and then he goes off to his little secret lair place on the island in the little lake. He paddles off to it, and he's pissed off. And then after a second, Gollum realizes that the ring's gone, like, which is the ring Bilbo has. This is a ring of power. This is the ring, the Lord of the Rings, hence the name. Well, this has been the object of Gollum's obsession, and why he's been hanging out in this cold, dark lake for hundreds of years anyways, right? So he's like really mad now that his ring's gone. And now he kind of starts to suspect, what has it got in its pockets and he kind of like wigs out on Bilbo and starts paddling back towards Bilbo at the other shore. He's like, wait, you have my ring, or, kind of like. So now Bilbo knows, like, yeah, Gollum's coming to kill me now. He's really mad. And Bilbo's kind of confused. He doesn't know what he has yet. So Bilbo draws his sword and he's running away, and he ends up accidentally putting the ring on. And then Gollum comes to him, and Gollum runs by him. And Bilbo's like, what? Or so that's kind of when Bilbo discovers the ability of the ring, which is invisibility. So this is a very cool. So Bilbo has a ring of invisibility, like, cool, just in time, right? So essentially, Gollum somehow thinks that Bilbo's running away to the way out, which he doesn't know the way out. But then Bilbo thinks that, well, Gollum must think I'm running out, or so Gollum inadvertently leads him to the way out. Bilbo's invisible. He kind of follows him. And then he gets to this kind of cool final confrontation with Gollum, where Gollum's blocking the exit, and Bilbo kind of has to like jump over him. And then Gollum feels a rush of air, and he's like, ah, and like wigs out. It's pretty good. And then Bilbo has escaped. And then Bilbo kind of sees all these swarming goblins, that are, he's almost caught up with Gandalf and the dwarves now. So, and there's this interesting idea where, so even when Bilbo has on the ring and he's invisible, you can still be seen in the full sunlight by your shadow. So that's kind of a cool, like, little deep physics, almost little kind of light reflection kind of thing there, where you can even be invisible optically, but maybe in full sunlight you could still cast a shadow. So that's kind of a fun little intricacy there. Like, it's not, so it still has a limitation of the invisibility functionality, like and there's so many swarming goblins chasing the dwarf party, that so Bilbo is invisible, but he still has to kind of hide in the tree shadows and kind of skip to eat these shadows behind the trees, so that his shadow isn't seen by all these swarming goblins looking everywhere for stuff. So kind of Bilbo kind of makes his way, does that, funny bit, finagling, and he ends up catching up. He breaks away from the goblins swarming the hillsides, and he ends up catching up to the dwarf party and Gandalf, and that's when kind of the dwarves and Gandalf are like, wait, where's Bilbo? Or, and all the commotion or whatever, they even forgot about their own party member, apparently. Well, and then Thorin's like, oh, I knew he was unqualified, we shouldn't even have brought him, or something. And then Gandalf's like, well, I'll go back for him myself if I must, I brought him on this journey, blah, blah, blah. And like, they're kind of grumbling and all like upset about this. And then Bilbo just kind of uninvisibilifies out of nowhere, like, hey, here I am, and they're like, they're all kind of like spooked or whatever. And then Bilbo gains kind of their tremendous respect, that like, wow, how'd you escape? Oh, just kind of, did burglar stuff, or, it's like, but Gandalf suspects something's up, but, so they don't know he has a magic invisibility ring yet, or anything like this, but Bilbo gains kind of street cred, to the dwarfs there. So, they carry on, well, later that night, these pack of essentially dire wolves, like wargs, these wolf packs kind of catch their scent, and they're kind of in cahoots with the goblins, dark creatures of the area or whatever. So that they're being chased by these giant wolves and stuff, and they end up having to go up into the trees tree canopies to get away from these snapping wolves that are chasing them, because wolves are fast. Obviously, you can't really outrun wolves. So they go up into the tree canopies, and then Gandalf does Gandalf firework cool business again. He starts grabbing acorns and lighting them on fire, but it's like magic Gandalf fire, so it's like extra potent or something. So he starts throwing these acorns that he has caught aflame, onto the ground and at these wargs and wolves, and they're getting all. It's pretty effective. But then the goblins catch up to the party and kind of catch all this commotion, and the goblins kind of come back into the scene, and they're like, ha ha ha. Or so they start putting out the fires around, but they keep the fire under the trees that the Gandalf, the dwarves, and Bilbo are in, and they're going to burn them to death. That's, they're like, oh, you want to play with fire, so that they start to use it back against them. So now that they know they're in big trouble, well, now you have a cool, story device here of kind of these magic eagles show up. So there's like evil creatures in Middle Earth, and then the kind of benevolent creatures. So these eagles show up, and they're Gandalf had helped their leader in the past or something. So he's kind of has their affiliation or allegiance to some extent. He's Gandalf or whatever. So the eagles kind of pick them up, and they bail them out of this calamity that they're in. Well, the eagles take them to the Great Shelf, which is like this mountaintop ledge where you can't really climb up to it, then you can't descend from it. I mean, this is basically like the eagle's perch, of way high up, and it kind of has this feeling of like from Skyrim, like the throat of the world a little bit, like there's kind of these wise beings up there, and you're kind of just at the heights, up there. Kind of gives me that vibe a little bit. I probably just have pareidolia, or, but essentially the eagles help them out, and they even catch food for them and help them start a fire up on this great ledge, and they get food and and but then they're ready for their next leg of their journey. They rest up and get food, and the eagles drop them off at a nearby hilltop where they can actually, descend from and not fall to their deaths. Well, basically the goblins and wolves are still kind of on their tail, or they're still getting they got to keep moving, kind of, and their provisions will run out, so they kind of have to still keep moving. And they eventually Gandalf realizes they're near this person's house called Bjorn, and he's a skin changer. He changes to this giant bear form at night, and during the day he's this kind of tall, disgruntled caveman-like dude that's kind of standoffish and So essentially, Gandalf pulls off a really cool feat here of kind of convincing Bjorn to aid them, even though he hates dwarves. Well, they have 13 dwarfs with them, and Bjorn's never met any of these people. So, and Bjorn is the last of the skin changers, so he is kind of not very happy. He's kind of and Bjorn, being a skin changer, he is kind of has this tremendous fondness for animals because he's an animal, essentially, in a way. So he has these giant bees and these groves and ponies and this wonderful estate, essentially, kind of this little cottage, but it's essentially like this wonderful estate kind of in surrounding pasture that he's kind of caretaken. But, he's not, that's his stuff, So Gandalf and Bilbo first kind of walk up to Bjorn when he's in man form, more agreeable. You can talk to him easier, but he's still very standoffish and skeptical. Well, Gandalf kind of, in a very clever ruse, he essentially kind of placates Bjorn's angry tendency by introducing him and Bilbo first, and even then he's like, kind of not having it. Well, and then he introduces the dwarves 2 by 2, and he kind of without kind of this weird simultaneity of it. It's not like Gandalf's withholding information, but he kind of slowly doses out the information, slowly spills the beans. Like, yeah, can like me, Bilbo, and 13 dwarves kind of like hang out here and like get food from you? It's like, but in Gandalf's typical, diplomatic mastery, he achieves it, and they end up telling Bjorn kind of their story of their harrowing journey through the Misty Mountains and their encounter with the goblins and such. And this kind of wins Bjorn's respect and interest. And Bjorn has a very interesting thing he says here. Bjorn says, "A very good tale," said he, "the best I have heard for a long while. If all beggars could tell such a good one, they might find me kinder. You may be making it all up, of course, but you deserve a supper for the story all the same. Let's have something to eat." So they, he's like, well, even if you made it up, that's kind of cool enough. Like, all right, like I'll give you some food and be cool and let you be on your way. So they kind of narrowly win Bjorn's favor, and then so Bjorn fixes them up with ponies, and they're ready for their next stage, going on to Mirkwood. And this is kind of like a dark forest, this Mirkwood place. Now there's kind of a wood elf stronghold there, led by Thranduil, and they kind of have this wine bootlegging. They kind of have this wine shipment business going on there. But Bjorn fixes them up with ponies and stuff, and they go to the edge of Mirkwood. Gandalf goes with them to the edge of the forest, and Bjorn kind of tags along in bear form from afar, watching. And like if they don't return his ponies, he's gonna get them. It's like Bjorn's still cool, like to a point. You can't screw him over. So essentially, And then Gandalf gives them kind of information about what they'll face in Mirkwood, and they're going to kind of, it's like a forest, but it's very unforgiving, and there's kind of spiders there, and there's one dark stream that passes through, but it's not really fit to drink out of, and there's this idea of kind of a dark labyrinth, and you can easily lose your way in Mirkwood, so it's kind of a cool concept. Well, Gandalf departs the party once more. Gandalf has to go do cool Gandalf stuff. He kind of rotates around Middle Earth. Like Gandalf has a lot on the to-do list, on the Gandalf task spreadsheet or whatever. So Gandalf has to go do something else. And there's mention of like a necromancer in southern Mirkwood, and in the Hobbit movie trilogy, they kind of go into this more, that it's like Sauron returning and marshaling goblin armies at Dol Guldur, and he's the necromancer. So they kind of go into that more in the Hobbit movie trilogy, and that was a cool opportunity for Peter Jackson to kind of expound upon that. But when Tolkien wrote this book in 1937, he hadn't really fleshed out much of the Middle Earth lore yet, or kind of what's going on. So there's this mention in the book, there's this mention of the necromancer in southern Mirkwood, but that it's kind of left at that. Like Gandalf's going to go, do Gandalf stuff or investigate, and there's kind of just this mention of like a necromancer operating in southern Mirkwood. So it's kind of a cool specter of a shadow of a doubt, and they kind of just need to book it through northern Mirkwood and try not to lose their way, and they'll have limited provisions. So it's kind of a cool thing. You even get a little bit of backpacking difficulties mentioned here, like so they all load up with packs and provisions from Bjorn, but even then, they mentioned that, our packs will get lighter, but by the times our packs are lighter, that means you're running low on food, so that's kind of the backpacker's dilemma, I suppose. So Gandalf's gone, and they send the ponies back towards Bjorn's house, and they kind of know the way, and the dwarves and Bilbo are on their own, the little party of 14 now, and they kind of begin their journey through treacherous Mirkwood. And the name Mirkwood, murky, it's hard to see your way or something, so it's a wonderful name. And they begin going, and quickly they almost fall under this weird spell, like they're kind of get drowsy or something, and they get lost easily and turned around and going in circles, and they even begin to hallucinate, like they'll hallucinate like an elvish festival, and they hear harps, and they think they smell food being cooked in like a nearby grove clearing, and then they'll walk over and it's like poof, gone. So an incredible similarity to like fairy stories there, so that's really fun. Even a little bit of kind of the lotus eaters from Greek mythology, and you have this white lotus show out now, and in the white lotus show, the people kind of get embroiled perhaps too much in their vacation destinations. They get kind of a little bit too hung up there, and that's kind of what the lotus eaters in Greek mythology, you kind of start eating these lotus leaves, and it's almost like kind of opiate type of idea. You just kind of like zone out, and you're just kind of there forever or something. It's kind of neat. And in Percy Jackson and the Lightning Thief, they kind of go into that lotus stuff. But you kind of have a little bit of that idea. They're like hallucinating, and they're getting stuck in Mirkwood, going in circles and stuff. So eventually Bilbo's separated from the dwarf party, and they're all kind of wigging out, hallucinating or something. Perhaps from low food and water as well. But Bilbo kind of comes to and realizes like this spider's coming up on him, like, and he pulls out his sword from Gondolin and sticks him, and the spider's like, oh, it stings or something, and he's dispatched his foe there. Well, then he names his sword Sting, so he kind of gets his sword gets its namesake. And then Bilbo's like, oh man, like I gotta go find the dwarves, like this is getting sketchy, getting hairy here, So he finds the dwarfs. They're all tied up in spider webs, and he kind of frees them, and it's around this time that Bilbo lets on, like, hey, I have a magic ring that lets me turn invisible, like how useful. So, and then he frees the dwarfs, and that they demand, one of them demands to hear the story about his riddles with Gollum over and over again. This is a very lively tale, and it distracts them from their current difficulties they're facing. And then after a little bit, they're like, okay, yeah, we got to get going. Well, not soon after this, they escape the spiders' kind of captivity, and then they, in typical Hobbit fashion, out of the frying pan into the fire or whatnot, now they escape the spiders just to get captured by the wood elves, of course, like of Thranduil's ilk. And this is a cool part, because like the dwarves are captured, and Bilbo at the last minute slips on the invisibility ring, and he kind of like follows them into the wood elf stronghold, but he's not detected. The dwarves are imprisoned there, and they kind of refuse to play ball with Thranduil's kind of semi-interrogation, like, what are you doing in my lands? What is the nature of your being here and stuff? And the dwarves are kind of on this secret, spec ops mission to go reclaim the treasure hoard of the dragon, and and many people would think this is unwise because you're rousing a dragon. It's like almost a greedy quest, but it's also a reclamation of their homeland and their kingdom. So there's kind of righteous and unrighteous aspects of their quest, and they sure don't want to tell this wood elf about it. And there's this whole history between dwarves and elves that they essentially hate each other and had wars. There's kind of racism going on there, so it's kind of a neat reference. So essentially, the dwarves are in prison, because they're stubborn dwarves, and also they don't want to reveal the full nature of their quest. Well, Bilbo ends up stealing a key invisibly and like freeing the dwarfs, and they lash these. The elves have this. The elves are all drunk on wine, like they have this wine harvest festival or something or other, and the elves are particularly drunk on wine that evening, and then Bilbo uses this story device essentially to have an easier time freeing the dwarves. and escaping with them, they lash these wine barrels together and escape down the river stream. You know, the elves use this stream to ship their wine to Lake Town, and the dwarves ride this sketchy raft to Lake Town essentially, and that is where we will end part 1, and part 2 will kind of go into through the lake town and the Lonely Mountain, and confronting Smaug, and Battle of 5 Armies and the return journey and all of that fun stuff. So take care, and have a good one.